The premiers of Saskatchewan, Ontario and New Brunswick are planning to collaborate on the development of small modular reactors. And of course, that could be welcome news for companies with big uranium assets in Saskatchewan, the best place on the planet to mine uranium. We're joined now by Brad Wall, former premier of the province, and also a director at NextGen Energy, which is working on a uranium project. Can we kick off, though, first with NAFTA? And thanks so much for joining us. Looks like this thing is moving towards ratification in Washington anyway. What's your overall view? I mean, do you welcome this deal?
Well, good to talk to you, Andrew, and you're right. And we were hearing in meetings yesterday that there was a deal, and it looked very promising for USMCA. So, I mean, you've had now the two pressers, one from the Democrats and one from the Republicans, and I think there's some agreement over pharma on the policy issue here in the United States, but it sounds like there is agreement, consensus to move forward with USMCA with a few adjustments. That's very positive. I think everyone was worried that impeachment was sucking up all of the oxygen in this town in Washington, and that something as big as and as important as the ratification of the trade deal might take the back burner. And so this is very good news, obviously, for all the partners in USMCA. It's very good news for Canada.
I mean, Saskatchewan, obviously a huge commodity producer. You guys feed the world with chickpeas and mustard. The list goes on. Were you generally happy with the new NAFTA deal when it was signed?
And lentils and yellow peas and field peas, and we can go down the list. Absolutely. I mean, it was imperfect, obviously. There were the trade deal itself, but I think the pursuit of perfection is sometimes the enemy of the good, and it was very important that the federal government get a deal, and they did. And so, the market, of course, the economy hates uncertainty. And even in advance of this apparent deal, this consensus today towards ratification, there was still a little bit of uncertainty until that deal is signed. And so I think today's a very positive day and a good step forward. Saskatchewan, obviously, is a trading province, like all of the provinces in the Dominion of Canada. It's important to note we've been working hard, and Premier Moe is working very hard to diversify our export markets. We're the second least dependent province on the U.S. for exports, and we are still 50% dependent, though. So that tells you just how dependent all of the provinces are. If the second least dependent province is still requires half of its exports to be going to that one market south of the border.
We'll get to NextGen Energy and your role there in a second, because I'm intrigued to see why you wanted to tie up with them. But talk to us about this initiative to stimulate the small modular reactors. What's your take on that?
Well, I think it's very positive. If we're serious about climate change, we need to have a discussion, more than a discussion. We need to focus on the opportunities around nuclear, which is baseload power that is zero emissions. It's the only baseload power that would be zero emissions, and technology is improving in terms of renewables and solar on the battery side of things, so that it can approximate more of a baseload power profile. But right now, nuclear is the zero emissions option, and Canada's a leader, as you noted in the introduction, in terms of producing uranium. 20% of the power in Canada today does come from nuclear power, and I think these three premiers have done the right thing to start the dialogue and shine some light on small modular reactor technology. This is the kind of technology at relatively small megawattage that can replace coal or can replace fossil fuel power plants without having to incur huge costs to completely change the grid. And in our province, we have been for some time funding at the Nuclear Center at the University of Saskatchewan, the research center there, a focus on SMRs, and so credit to these premiers. We need to have this discussion. If we're serious about climate change, then Canada has a role to play in technology, in CCS, yes, in nuclear, and on the non-technological side, also the LNG case for replacing fossil fuels in Asia. That is a meaningful climate change plan. I hope the Liberals and the Conservatives consider nuclear and these other technological options to be a bigger part of Canada's climate change plan.
Well, of course, yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the argument that LNG will curb carbon emissions by displacing coal in Asia, but you probably saw that story on the weekend, the new Environment Minister casting doubt on that argument, saying, well, for example, liquefaction of LNG does produce a whole bunch of carbon. So the case is not closed. The jury is still out, I think, on that one.
It is. It was very disappointing to see those remarks because, we are, at any given time over the last year or so, there have been between 1,400 and 1,600 coal-fired plants on the books or under construction. And notwithstanding his concern about emissions in terms of production of LNG, we know what's worse. What's worse is coal. And so I was disappointed to hear those remarks from the minister. Canada can be a world leader. We are so focused, myopically so, on our 1.7% of global emissions and pricing those. And Canada needs to do more to reduce those emissions. But Andrew, it's all we ever talk about. It's the focus of the federal government is on that carbon tax. When we could be leaders in technology, that's the nuclear piece, that's CCS, and where we could have a much more robust vision for LNG replacing coal globally.
I know, we better not get too political. I mean, the Liberals would say, well, we're investing big time in renewable and energy saving as well. But because I do want to hear about Next Gen Energy. It has that big position in the southwest Athabasca Basin. Wow, more than 200,000 hectares. Why did you want to get involved with Next Gen Energy?
Well, it's transformational for our province. It's going to be the largest uranium mine on the planet. It's going to produce at a low cost. The company itself has just a great reputation for already engaging with the community, the closest one to Lost, with First Nations, with all the communities around it. It has a serious approach to making sure this thing is environmentally sustainable as it moves towards getting into production. And so we've been in Washington on the trade front, because you'll remember in the summer, there was some progress on a presidential order 232, which lumped Canadian uranium in with uranium from what some would probably describe as bad actors, and as a part of a national security initiative. And so, happily, we saw that order, the administration back away from 232. They replaced it with a nuclear working group. And that working group's been obviously focused on this particular issue for the United States. They want to increase their own domestic supply because they obviously need to export a lot of uranium. Fair enough, even were they to be successful there, they would need a lot of uranium for their civilian nuclear fleet. And they want to make sure that as they import uranium, that national security concerns are paramount. And so our message here has been, look, don't lump Canada in with these countries. Let's avoid unintended consequences. And there were good meetings yesterday. Obviously, we talked about small modular reactors as well, as the U.S. looks to this trend. Interestingly, yesterday, the regulator here approved the operating licenses for 2 existing nuclear plants at Turkey Point, Florida, for between 60 and 80 years. That's effectively a new nuclear reactor getting approved. 60 to 80 year approval extension for those operating license, and there's reason for some guarded optimism in this space, both as the world looks at uranium and nuclear in terms of climate change, and it's true as well that there's supply issues going forward in the mid and the long term, and NextGen is going to be, Saskatchewan and NextGen are going to be a big part of meeting that demand, so it's positive.
And why did Saskatchewan never build its own nuclear capacity? Because you have the best uranium mines in the world.
Early in my time, we did look at it. We undertook a study and a public consultation, and the challenge was SMR technology wasn't advanced enough that it was the obvious alternative to conventional nuclear. And conventional nuclear is, it's over 1,000 megawatts, and the challenge with it would be that, the attendant cost to the grid to make all the grid changes from a system whereby you have a lot of smaller plants, coal and now natural gas and some hydro, located all over the province, to one large plant of just a few generating places. That was a challenge, and the attendant costs, I think, were prohibitive. But we did start to invest money at the University of Saskatchewan, the Dr. Sylvia Fedoruk Nuclear Center for Research, and part of the mandate there was SMRs. and working with companies that were interested in small modular reactor technology. And credit Premier Moe, frankly, their government has a much bolder vision for this. And as you can see, he's got the agreement of Premier Ford and Premier Higgs to work together with those three provinces. I hope the federal government's interested because, yes, they've got a vision for renewables, but Canada has to also be focused on zero emissions or low emissions baseload energy, and we can be a global leader, perhaps, in this area, especially when we hear from State Department and the Department of Energy down here in our meetings that SMR is, this technology is, has the attention of this administration as well. So here's an opportunity for North America, I think, and certainly for Canada and obviously for Saskatchewan as a world leader in the supply of uranium.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I know Ottawa has made some moves toward the SMR, but it's such an exciting technology. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. It's always great to hear from you. Our guest,
all the best, Andrew.
Our guest has been Brad Wall, former Premier of Saskatchewan and a Director at NextGen Energy.